Well, good morning and welcome to Coffee with the Pastor. I'm on day 4 of my isolation. I have COVID. I appreciate your prayers. My symptoms have been very mild. I've been isolated up on our second floor. It's a good place to be isolated. We have taken what most people would make a game room. I guess it's called a game room most houses, but it's my office. I've got books lining. You can see some of my books background. I got it all around here. So I got my computer up here, and so I'm good. And even though I didn't think I would ever have to communicate with my wife by text, she's been testing negative, and so she doesn't have COVID and no symptoms or anything. So she's downstairs, staying away from me, and we communicate over text. So I've been designated to be upstairs, but it's a good place to be. We've got bedrooms up here, bathroom, books. I'm good. Been able to catch up on some reading that I haven't had to. So keep praying that my symptoms will stay mild. I've talked to some people that had that, and they said, well, just wait. Sometimes it gets worse. So far, mine hasn't. I have some very mild symptoms, but nothing really that's that bad. And I appreciate that. I feel blessed because of that. I do want to say that the lesson today I'm very excited about. You'll see why. It may be a little longer than my usual 5 to 10 minutes. And so if you're at work or something and you do this 5 to 10 minutes and you don't have much longer than that, you might want to just watch this later. I'll put it up on YouTube later in the day, and it'll be here on Facebook. But we're talking about at the end of chapter 27. And yesterday you realized that really Rebecca, Jacob's mother, organized kind of a coup or a ruse, and they fooled the older Isaac, whose eyesight is bad, who's probably dying, and they tricked him into blessing Jacob rather than Esau. That sounds really bad, but I'm not so sure that Rebecca just wasn't more in tune with God's plans than Isaac was. God had revealed to Rebecca when the babies were in the womb, that the older would serve the younger. And so for whatever reason that happened, Esau comes in, he's disappointed. He doesn't get the real blessing. He gets a blessing, but he doesn't get the real blessing that he wants. And so he's vowing, and Rebecca's overhearing him. He says, my father's mourning days will be soon. In other words, my dad's going to die soon. And when the time of mourning for him is over, I'm killing Jacob. And this concerns her. So she goes to Jacob. She says, you've got to go. You've got to leave. You've got to leave now. And so she's going to work it out with Isaac. She goes to Isaac, and she says to Isaac, she says, you know, I do not want Jacob marrying women from this area. And in chapter 27, verse 46, she goes, then Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife among the women of this land from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living. And so she goes, and of course, apparently Esau's 2 Hittite wives just caused misery for Isaac and Rebekah. She just goes to Isaac. She says, Jacob's not going to take a wife from here. If he gets a wife from here, I don't think I'll be able to go on living. So Isaac calls in chapter 28, calls Jacob in, tells him that he wants to go back, send back to Rebekah's brother's house, Laban, which he'd be back in Mesopotamia. So I want you to go back there, and I want you to find a wife there, probably in his household. So he blesses him. Now, that's very interesting. He wouldn't have blessed him if he had before, but now he's blessed him. He realizes that it's really God's plan. It's God's work in this. It wasn't Jacob's ruse. It wasn't Rebekah's ruse. It was God's getting Isaac to get on board with his plan upon the blessed, the promise being carried out. So he gets Jacob, he blesses him, he sends him to Laban's house. So Jacob takes off, and he stops for the night. And he lays down, he finds a rock, and he lays down, and he falls asleep. And he has a dream, and I think more likely a vision. And we talk about Jacob's ladder, and there's a ladder from heaven to earth, and the angels are descending and coming up. And it's a place where earth and heaven meet, and where the heavenly and the earthly come together. And then there's the voice of God comes from off this ladder. And it tells Jacob that he's with him, and he's going to be blessed. And it's going to be through his descendants that the blessing is going to continue, and that he's going to make him rich, and he's going to do all these things for him. He's going to have lots of descendants, and the promised blessing will come through him. And he wakes up the next morning. And I kind of want to pick this up because it's really good. This is in verse 16 of chapter 28. It says, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, or in the Hebrew it would be Bethel. It means the house of God. Though the city used to be called Luz. And when we go to Israel, we have a guide who for over 25 years was the chief archaeological director for the city of David. He found many of the finds in Jerusalem. If you watch any of the religious channels, they have a finding over there. They usually go interview Eli, and he talks about it. Eli is convinced that he found the spot where Jacob laid. And I'm going to show you a picture, and it doesn't do it justice, and I'll talk about it. But there's a bottom rock there, and then there's a rock on top of it. And the reason the picture doesn't do it justice, I've got it. I'm going back in December. And by the way, if you want to go with us, we have room. Love to have you. And it is a trip of a lifetime. I get more excited the more times I go. But we'll get to see this when we go in December. And I'm going to take some better pictures. I'm going to take some more pictures so I can show people better. But on the sides, what you can't see is that carved into the rock, the stone through there are troughs where the blood would run off the sacrifices. Now, who was sacrificing around this area? Well, you have Melchizedek, who was the high priest and king of Salem. Salem, according to the Psalm, was Zion, and Zion is the name for Jerusalem. So very well, Melchizedek could have been sacrificing there. Now, what you're not seeing, there's a kind of a stone wall here. On the other side of that stone wall, there is an old olive press, still there. And this thing's been sitting there, and they found this just not a long time ago, within the last 10 years. It's not out for public display. It's still down where they are doing excavations. Well, the neat thing about going with Eli, he is so well known as an archaeologist. He has keys to get down there. And just about no other tour groups get to go except for Eli's group. We get to go down and see this thing. And I remember Gary Cameron, the first time we went down, he was talking about it. He said, I felt like I needed to pull off my shoes. It was a holy place. But very likely, given the olive press where they would have anointed the sacrifices and all, and you're even seeing here where Jacob anointed them within, well, there had been olive press there, and it was there then. And but Jacob fell asleep, had this vision, Jacob's dream, heaven come, and he says, I was in a place of the Lord and I didn't know it. He says, actually, I was in the house of the Lord, didn't know it. This is the place where God comes. This is where God comes to the earth and meets people. You have to understand, remember that in that day, God came to places like, he came to certain places, like with Adam and Eve, he came in the cool of the day at a certain place. You get the feeling that when he walked with Esau, he had a certain meeting time every day he came. Noah the same way. He actually, with Abraham, would come around the mayberry trees and some things, but he met him in different places. But God kind of came and gone. He came to a place. And we think this is maybe where Melchizedek did his things. And then the rock that would have been placed on top of it, he gets up and says, I'm in the house of the Lord, and I didn't know. So he takes the rock that he was sleeping on and puts it on top of it. It fits the scenario everywhere. You got an olive press, you got a sacrificial stone where they're like that. And he says, I was in the house of God and didn't know it. Well, how many houses of God were there back then? I mean, this is well before Moses, hundreds of years before Moses and Aaron and Levi. There's no tabernacle, there's no temple. Melchizedek was the high priest of the Most High God. They have found evidence that there was a group around this area and just outside of Jerusalem, a little north, where they were sacrificing to the one true God. Now, this is separate from Abraham's people. There was a group already worshiping the one true God before Israel's folks. They weren't the only ones. Now, God chooses the people of Israel to be able to bear his name and to bring it to other peoples. That was their calling, was to be a blessing to others, to other nations. There would be a blessing because they were to show them God and be a part of that and be a missionary people. But there was others. And so he sees God there and he has this experience. And my friend Ellie thinks that this is exactly where that happened. Others disagree, and I'll tell you where the difference is going to be. In chapter 35, he's called back to come to Bethel. Remember, he goes to Laban's house, he gets married. We'll talk about this later, but I just want to mention it today. And he's called to come back to Canaan. And by the way, Rebecca said she would send word when it was safe. She never did. I don't know why she didn't, but she never did. I don't know if she ever thought it was safe. But God called him to come back, so he did. And wasn't an easy trip. We'll study all about that later. But when he gets back and after he meets his brother and everything, he's called to settle back where God first spoke to him. And he calls the place Bethel. And it's obviously not the same spot because this is right in the city of David, under it. And it's today you have to go down about 30 feet in the excavations, but this place would have been more in Jerusalem. There was already a city there. And so then he moves to another place a few miles out. Well, you say, it can't be this place where he got admitted because he had to go to the same place. Well, Bethel means house of God. It was in the same area. He could not have went and settled where this was. There was already a city there. And what did Jacob have? Well, you're going to find out he's going to have all these sheep and everything. Just north of Jerusalem, as we come into Jerusalem, is the way we come in sometimes. And it's in the West Bank area now where they think the old ancient Bethel was. There's hills out there. And today, when you go through there, there's Bedouins all up and down those hills raising sheep, and it's good pasture land. He couldn't have taken all of his sheep and everything and overthrown a city. He would have had been just outside the city. So I think it's in the same area. Now, there's a lot of debate about that. I didn't realize how much. Ellie's convinced that that's where he met him, probably settled outside the city when he came back. But it makes sense because probably the only house of God that was going at that time would have been this one. This is where they've been doing sacrifice. That's where Melchizedek would have been doing sacrifices. Maybe those after him. I don't know if Melchizedek was still alive then, probably. But that's where sacrifice, that was about the only house of God. And if it's not the spot, I wonder why David was so intent on taking Jerusalem. Now, later on, hundreds of years, they're going to come and the children of Israel are going to take the promised land. One of the places they did not take, they didn't take the Philistines over by the Mediterranean, and they did not take Jerusalem. Jerusalem was fortified. And I think they just thought, hey, this would be too hard to take. When David got power, this is the first place he went. He said, I'm taking Jerusalem. Why was he so intent on taking Jerusalem? Well, I think it's because Melchizedek was there. And you realize that Hebrews says that Jesus was in the order of Melchizedek, the high priest and king. And he realized that the Most High God was there. And it's very interesting that when Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac, he came to that same mount. It was that same area. David is intent upon having Jerusalem as his capital. He is intent on having the temple there at the same spot where all this worship of God is. And why is that? Because they know this is a place that God comes. God came and spoke to Abraham. You know that Isaac, Jacob's dad, would have told him the story, and Jacob had to be a participant in it, where he almost was sacrificed, and God said, do no harm to the boy. And then there was a ram that he sacrificed instead, which we believe is kind of the basis for the sacrificial system that Moses and Aaron then will set up later. And I think he was very intent because of this and because of what happened to Abraham. That's going to be the spot where they're going to build a temple. And it is amazing to me that they came back and did that. How I want to end today is that, you know, back then they believed that God, you had to come to a place to meet God, or God would come to a place to meet you. I think it is good to have a place that you meet God. I've kind of made my study up here and my isolation chambers up here kind of a house of God, if you would say, to kind of be able to study and do some things I've been wanting to do. And you can do it anywhere. But let me give you the real thing about that, okay? Isaac was offered but not sacrificed, had a ram in substitution. Obviously, Melchizedek was doing sacrifices there, and a group of people who believed in the one high God. David came and built a temple there, where they did sacrifices and they did all the things there, and they had the Holy of Holies. So much so that the people from Galilee would take, you know, a week off from work every year, three times a year, to go to Jerusalem to talk to God, because I believe that's where you talk to God, because that's where God was. But there's somebody else sacrificed as a substitutionary atonement around Jerusalem, and that was Jesus. And Jesus changed things, because his sacrifice was once for all. And if you remember, when he was sacrificed on the cross, the veil to the Holy of Holies was ripped top to bottom, symbolizing God doesn't just belong in one spot. And then Jesus sent the Spirit of the living God, the Holy Spirit, on Pentecost. And then the Holy Spirit takes up residence in the believer. That's why Paul called it the temple of the Holy, or the temple of the Holy God. God dwells in us. Now, Jacob says, I was in a place of God and I didn't know it. Let me tell you something. If you're a believer, your body is the house of God. And wherever you go, it's the house of God. You're bringing the house of God with you. God is with you. You don't have to go to Jerusalem to see God, talk to God. You don't have to go to a particular place. You don't have to go to a church. He's with you. He's with you now. And you have 24/7 access to God. You don't have to fly over to Jerusalem and go by the Holy of Holies where they think it might have been and pray. You don't have to go on the Western Wall and pray. You don't have to come to our church and pray. God's with you. You are the house of God. And I want you to know it. I don't want you to be oblivious to it. I want you to recognize it and practice the presence of God in your life today. Well, that's chapter 28, and we'll keep moving tomorrow. We'll look at chapter 29 if you want to read ahead, and some interesting things about how the deceiver gets deceived, and we'll look at the life of Jacob. It's interesting. We had a lot about Abraham, a little about Isaac, just a couple chapters on that. There's going to be a lot about Jacob. And so Jacob's a very significant figure in the patriarchs. And I'm excited to bring these studies to you. Well, go be the house of God. And don't be oblivious that you're in the place of God and not know it. Go knowing it today. Blessings upon you.